Right, it's recording.
Great. Thanks, Mosin. Do you want me to say who I am?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So for those who don't know me, I'm Rachel Taylor. I'm a MAP grad, so I did the MAP at Melbourne Uni. So I got taught by Diane and Peggy. And I'm also involved in the SIP group, so continued working with Peggy. And in addition to that, I'm doing my PhD at the moment using social network analysis in a social enterprise context. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about my research within the context of how I've done it and how I've applied social network analysis. And so I'll get into that a little bit more once we get there. So my kind of introduction to social network analysis was through my PhD, which I started not having any idea what the concept was. So my background has obviously been in the pos-psych space, and before that I was in the sciences and then business and entrepreneurship. So social network analysis, it's a very multidisciplinary field / methodology, but it tends to kind of live more in the sociology and sort of broader social sciences. And my first introduction to the methodology in the pos-psych space was some of the work that comes out of the University of Michigan in the positive organisational scholarship literature, and the concept of energizer networks. And so my research has ended up focusing on that concept, but in the social enterprise context. So what I wanted to do today is really start at the beginning and go from the ground up, making no assumptions that you have even heard of social network analysis, and then taking you through what some of the key concepts are, some key examples that I've plucked from the literature that I thought were most related to well-being, and also had a different sort of range of different methodological approaches that I thought might help us tease out some of the research approaches. And then I'll end off with just a few ideas on if you wanted to get started in using social network analysis, where you might go and what you might look at. So hopefully that is what you were interested in hearing about today. If it isn't, ask me questions at the end. I have no idea how long I'll go for. I have no concept of time, so hopefully I'll stick to the hour. If not, I'm happy to hang around if others are as well. So when we think about networks, I wanted to start with just this. This is the Melbourne train network, and I think it gives us a really good sort of starting point. We're thinking about, well, what do we mean by a network? The term social networks, as inherent in social network analysis, has kind of become a little bit overshadowed by the idea of social networks. So sometimes what happens when I say I'm doing social network analysis, people will say, oh, are you looking at Facebook data or Twitter data or something like that? And so I just wanted to ground us in the idea of a network as being anything that has interconnections between us. Yep, so say in the train network, if you're wanting to get from Sunbury to Blackburn, then you're going to need to, by train, then you're going to need to use this network to catch the train from Sunbury into the centre and then change trains to get out to Blackburn. And so sometimes we talk about networks as being like pipes, and the interconnections between those pipes we call nodes. And so we sometimes think of networks as being things that things can travel through. Yep. And so when we're thinking about that in terms of human networks, we're normally thinking about the transmission of ideas or communication. Emotions is something we might be interested in pos-psych. But if you just think of the sort of idea of a train network, I think it kind of grounds it in something that's a little bit more physical and can be a little bit easier to conceptualize. So the other thing about networks is that we're not only talking about human ones, yeah? So this is a little map. This is a network map of a brain looking at neural networks. And so what this is showing is the little colored lines are vectors of electricity flowing from one neuron to another. So again, just to illustrate this idea of what we're talking about is the flows of something between things, which will make more sense in a minute. So when we get to human networks, we are obviously talking about people as agents. And sometimes we can have an integration of human agents and non-human agents. So we might be talking about the relationship between humans and books, you know, like how many people have read this book, and so then we would do a network connected to this book as an actor. But when we talk about social network analysis, we're typically looking primarily just at the human dimension. And what makes social network analysis kind of unique in the context of normal approaches that you would have encountered in psychology is that typically in psychology we're either looking at individual factors. So for example, you know, any kind of correlational study that you see, you would normally be looking at, say, two attributes within an individual and the relationship between those two attributes at the individual level. If you're looking at the culture of an organization or the culture of a country, you're looking at that group level. And what's distinctive about social network analysis is that what we call our unit of analysis, so what we're actually trying to measure or study is the invisible thing that connects people together, which is some kind of relationship. So we might be looking at whether people are friends or not, whether people are related, you know, by blood. We might be looking at who helps each other. So it's the actual relationship is what we're actually interested in studying. So this is where it starts to get a little bit abstract, which is why I kind of go back to train networks, because you can sort of picture them a little bit easier. But just keep that in mind, that what we're trying to understand is the relationships within the context of the individuals that those relationships exist within. And so just to give you a bit of lingo that goes with that. So if you look at this little diagram in the middle, the blue dots, if you think of them as people, and I'll show you a couple of network maps as we go through, but we call the actual actors, so typically it's a person, we call them nodes for some reason. It's just the lingo in social network analysis. And then the relationship that either exists, doesn't exist, or may have some kind of weighting, we call that the tie between them. So just to get your heads around that, that bit of terminology. So yeah, so we talk about nodes and we talk about ties. And so we then define a social network as a set of actors or nodes tied together by one or more types of relationships. And it can be any type of relationship. So we might be trying to understand the friendship networks in organizations. I've got some colleagues working on criminal networks. So who knows who in like terrorist networks or organized crime. We have community level networks where we're trying to understand the level of social connectedness within the community. So it really just depends what kind of relationship we're looking at and what it is we're trying to understand about that. And so the other key thing I want to sort of get your heads around and have you understand is that we've also got different kinds of networks that we can look at. And I'm going to give you little examples that help illustrate this concept for you. So we have three general kinds of networks. One is a type that we call ego networks. So as the name suggests, it's centered on an individual. So the ego, or that person, it's about that individual's network. We have whole networks, which is where we take an actual existing group of people that have some shared commonality. So it might be an organization, it might be a classroom, it might be a school, and we try and understand that whole community. And then we have multi-level networks, which I'll get to in a sec to illustrate it for you. So you're probably familiar with the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon concept. If you're not, this is a project that's been running for decades now, I think. And if you just Google it, you'll find the website and all this sort of thing. And I don't quite know why Kevin Bacon was chosen, but what people have started to do is map the ego network of Kevin Bacon. So the idea here is that you take Kevin Bacon as a person, and then you start to look at the movies that he's been in and which other actors have appeared in those movies with him. And so you can start to see here, this first level, that he's got the direct connections to. So these lines are our ties, the tie being, and they're actually named on this image, which is helpful. So here you can see the name is Sleepers, I think. So he was in Sleepers with John Slattery. And so that's considered a tie that Kevin Bacon has appeared in a movie with everyone that he has a direct line to. Yeah. And then what they've done is they've started to build out the second level of who else is connected to Kevin Bacon through the people that he's connected to. So you can start to see here that he was in a movie with John Slattery, and then John Slattery was in a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And so we consider Arnold Schwarzenegger, because he hasn't appeared in a movie with Kevin Bacon, there's what we call a degree of separation between the two of them. And that degree is John Slattery. Yep. So the key thing here that I want to get across is that this is centered on Kevin Bacon. So if we did the network for John Slattery, it would look completely different, because John would be the key person at the middle, and then it would be all his movie connections as opposed to Kevin Bacon's. Our next type of network is the whole network. So this is where we're taking a defined group of people and we're trying to map the connections between them. And again, just for ease of, accessibility of the information, I've gone with a Hollywood example. And so this is a map, I assume it's a map of connections that have people who've appeared in the same movies. It might be a map of people who like each other, or it could be anything, I don't know. I'm going to assume that it's co-appearances in movies. And so what you can see here is that this tries to capture maybe the top X actors within all of Hollywood. Yeah. So there's no individual that is being focused on here. It's actually Hollywood is the kind of collective network that we're trying to understand. What are the connections between people within that group? Yep. So hopefully that makes sense. And then our third type of network we can look at is where we want to try and integrate a second variable that is typically a non-human connection point. So we call these bivariate networks, and if they're an attribute in and of themselves, we normally would call them multi-level networks. So just to explain that, this is a network map of the characters in Shakespeare's Macbeth. So you can see them all listed here with their names. And then the second variable that's been added, which is these little boxes in purple, is which acts of the play each of those characters appear in. So you can see up here, for example, these characters, the doctor, the messenger, etc., they only appear in Act 5 of Macbeth. Whereas some of these more densely connected ones, like Macbeth, as you would expect, being the central character in the play, is appearing in multiple acts. And you can also see which characters Macbeth has some kind of interaction with because of the lines connecting Macbeth to different characters. And so a multi-level network might be the kind of thing you would use if you think that it's important, some other factor aside from just the relationship between people that is particularly important that will cluster them in some way. So for example, if you wanted to say, if you wanted to do a study on the people who've done MAP at Melbourne Uni and who knows each other, you might decide that a really important second characteristic is which cohort of MAP they were in. So each year is a different cohort, and so you could make a pretty sensible assumption that people who are in the same year group would be more likely to know each other than people who weren't in the same cohort. And so what you might do is introduce the cohort year as a second variable and create a map that looks a little bit similar to this, where you've got both the names of the individuals and which cohort they're a part of. So I've seen research like this where people have looked at, say, like co-authorship in the academic world, and they've also put in the second variable of which institution the person is from. So you'd have not only, say if you did a map of the positive psychology literature, you might have not only, you know, Seligman, Csikszentmihalyi, Bella Broderick, Kern, Jardin, everybody, but you also might include their institution so that you can start to see where the clusters are of where people are starting to collaborate with each other across those institutions as well as at the individual level. So that's our three different kinds of networks. The main ones that I'm going to focus on today, because they're more sort of typical, are the whole networks and these bivariate networks. And keeping in mind that they're kind of the same thing, it's just whether you focus on just a single variable or whether you introduce a second one. So we're not going to talk too much about ego networks, just because I don't think we'll get through all that in time because it's slightly different methods and approaches and stuff. Okay, so is that all making sense? Any questions at this stage about just those key conceptual things? All making sense, hopefully. All right, and so when we start to think about networks and network analysis, and bringing this idea that we're trying to study relationships, there's a key premise. I couldn't remember if the plural of premises was premises or something else. Anyway, hopefully premises is correct. But there's sort of two key ones that I think are of relevance to us. First of all is this idea that the actual social structure that people are embedded in has an impact on their outcomes in some way, shape or form. And it also has an impact on not only the individuals within it, but the outcomes for that group. So this is a kind of key empirical and theoretical assumption that is embedded in social network research. So the idea here is that the existence or non-existence of certain relationships will affect the network and affect the individuals within that network. And the other key thing is that, you know, what makes social network analysis different to other kinds of network analysis is that because we're talking about humans, that they have agency and intentionality, which means that they behave in certain ways on that basis, yeah? And so this is where we get into some of the key concepts that I'll talk about a bit later around choices that people make as a consequence of their positions within networks and shifts they want to actually make in those networks. And so that means that in essence, when we're thinking about SNA, we're thinking about the actual relational structures. So that at the network level, what do the relationships look like? We're interested in the actual relationships themselves in terms of what kinds of relationships they are and whether they exist or not, or how, like the valence of them, and also the actual attributes of the actors. And I'll dig into this a little bit in a second. So I thought I'd go back to our Hollywood map here, because this is a sort of useful one to bring out some of these concepts. So what we can see here in this map is that we've got all these different people, and some are connected to others and some aren't. And so this gives us the overall structure of this network. And you can also see that there's different colors and there's different sizes of the nodes. And so when we create these kind of network maps, we can do these are called sociograms, these maps, and we can manipulate them in certain ways to bring out certain features of the overall network. And so what this network here is showing us through the different colorizations is that, do you see my mouse when I do it on the screen? Everyone's muted, so they can't tell me.
Yeah, we can see it, Rach. We can.
Oh, good. So what you can see here is a kind of cluster that's coloured in blue nodes, and then there's a cluster here that's coloured in purple, green, etc. And this has been done to kind of highlight that there are clusters in the network. Yeah, if there were no clusters, the network would just be kind of pretty evenly spread. And so what we might determine from this network and the analysis that's been done here is that we have a kind of Tom Hanks cluster. We have a, whoever these people out here are, cluster. It looks like there's a cluster that comes out of Cuba Gooding Jr. and a cluster that comes out of, that's strongly connected to Meg Ryan. And so that might help us to kind of know, well, who are the key players in this network? Yeah. And also the size of the node here. So you can see in this instance that Tom Hanks, his node bubble is much bigger than everyone else. And so assuming that this map is a map of people who've been in movies with each other, this suggests that Tom Hanks is someone that has been in movies with a lot of other people. And so he has what we term a high in degree. And so what an in degree is essentially when you ask the question, have you starred in a movie with Tom Hanks? The more people that say yes to that question, and so essentially are pointing at him, the higher his in degree will be. As opposed to the ones that are much smaller and out on the periphery. If we take, for example, I think this is Rosie O'Donnell, you know, if you asked who have you appeared in a movie with, very few people have said that they've been in a movie with Rosie O'Donnell. And so she has a smaller in degree than Tom Hanks. By contrast, and then the flip side is an out degree, which is the people that you're pointing at, which I'll talk to a little bit more when I get to my research because it's a bit more relevant than here. And so the other thing that we can start to see is who is connected to who, and going back to this idea that networks are things through which information and different things can flow. And so if this was a map of, say, an organization, if I was this person out here, Robert Longo, if I wanted to, the sort of conceptual idea here is that I'm quite well connected to Keanu Reeves, but I'm not very well connected to Jim Cash, who's over here. And so if we think back to our network map of the Melbourne train network, if I'm Robert Longo over here, and I want to get a message to Jim Cash, presumably I kind of need to go through Keanu Reeves, who then goes through Cuba Gooding Jr., etc., etc. And so the more connected you are within the network, there are metrics that kind of go along with that, that kind of enable you to understand the networkness of somebody, which I'll get to in a minute. So I just wanted to kind of point that out as well. So the other thing we might be interested in is the actual type of tie attributes that we're looking at here. So the kinds of relationships. And to a degree, we're often just interested in the existence of it or not. So in this map, we can see very clearly that Keanu Reeves hasn't been in a movie with John Cusack because they don't have that relationship between them. Now, the other thing that might be relevant is what kind of relationship this is. So if this is a map of who starred in a movie with who, then it's a different kind of social network than if we were asking them who likes who, or who's been married to who, or who dislikes who. So the actual nature of the relationship is important as well. And then the third thing we might be interested in is the actual attributes of each actor. No pun intended, because these are actors in this map. But we might be interested in what is it about these individuals? Is there things that we can associate with their position in this network and something about them? So in this particular example, we might be able to gather information on their gender, their race. There might be, you know, whether they studied at some particular acting institute or school. There might be something that we think plays a role in their importance or not in this network and the position that they kind of hold. And so we are often interested in those factors as well. And so, for example, if we were trying to understand who becomes friends with who in a school classroom, there might be particular factors that play a role in that, such as personality might play a particular factor. And so we might create a network map, and then we might overlay through colouring and mathematical statistics what it is about those individuals that might be playing a role in those positions in the network. Okay, so the other thing I just wanted to give you a sense of was that, as I was talking about, that the actual network structure is a key variable and often what we're trying to understand. And so the purpose of this little slide is just to give you an idea that these are 4 different networks with the same number of actors, so the same number of nodes, but they obviously have very different structures. So this one at the top here is, you know, you can see this clustering effect where you've got these 5 very distinct groups and not a lot of connection between them. Here we have another set of clustering, but there's a lot more connection across and between them. And these 2 over here is where we've got a much more dense and more what we call centralized network, where we have these individuals in the center with what we call very high in degree, because we've got a lot of people connected to them, as opposed to this network up here where we have a much more distributed end degree because people are not as connected across their different cluster groups. Okay, so then when we're thinking about networks, and again, we're talking about whole networks here, we're able to get a distinct set of people and look at all the relationships that exist between and across them. There's these certain features that we look for. So a key one, which is not actually listed here, is what we call the density of the network, and that is the degree to which people are connected to each other. So as I just mentioned, this one down the bottom here is a very dense network with a few kind of outliers compared to this network, which has high density within the clusters. So you can see, you know, this green cluster is quite dense within itself compared to this yellow cluster, which is not as dense because there's not as many interconnections within that group. And then outside of those groups, we have very few interconnections. So the other thing that we're kind of interested in is what we call brokerage is often a really strong key metric in social network analysis. And the idea of brokerage is that you have an individual who acts as a bridge between different sets of people. So if I jump back here for a second, what we can see in this top network is that this person here in pink and this person here in green, this is a brokerage relationship. And the reason that we call it a brokerage is because for this cluster, the green cluster, the sort of aqua cluster, to connect to the pink cluster, they kind of have to get through this relationship in order to make that happen. So this might happen, for example, if these represent different organisations. Say if the pink was Melbourne Uni and the aqua was University of Pennsylvania, and you had two individuals who had that relationship, but nobody else in those two organisations had a relationship with each other. Yep. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, that this person here is Peggy, and this is everyone at Melbourne Uni, and this aqua person here is Martin Seligman. So Martin Seligman's connected with all his friends at University of Pennsylvania. Marty knows Peggy. Peggy knows everyone at Melbourne Uni, but everyone else at Melbourne Uni doesn't know anyone else at University of Pennsylvania. I know that that's not true, but just for the sake of illustrating it, let's go with that. And so what we would say there is that Peggy acts as a broker to the University of Pennsylvania. Because and we know this in practice, right? So if this was the case, if this was a true example, if I wanted to speak to someone at the University of Pennsylvania, it would be a really good idea for me to go and talk to Peggy, because Peggy has that direct connection. And so this is where we get these idea of what we call small worlds, which is where we have, by being able to connect to brokers, they give us access to other communities. And through those communities, we can connect to other communities. And so this is where we kind of start to think of the world being these series of interconnected groups, and that there are certain individuals that we can connect to those communities through them. And so in this example here, we can see that we've actually got two brokers in the yellow group that connect to 3 brokers in the pink group. All right. The other thing that we might be interested in is what we call closure. And so this is a measure of the density within the group. And this can be both a benefit and a restriction, because the more a group is kind of clustered together, and you can think of this as kind of isolating itself. Yep. So if you have a community that kind of, like going back here, this blue, dark blue community here, we might think of it as having a high degree of closure, because most of the people are very connected to each other, but they're very poorly connected to other aspects of this similar network. So if this was a network of an organization, and let's say, for example, this blue group was the finance department, and this green group was the R&D team, we can see that there's no connection here between the finance team and the R&D team. And so we might have a high level of efficiency in terms of information flows and collegiality and social cohesion within this blue group and within this green group. But we might have very different cultures and very different practices and levels, and virtually no understanding of what each other are doing, because we've got those, we don't have the ability to actually have that information flowing between those two teams. Yeah, so being able to understand that stuff is really important as well. And then closeness is a bit of a metric around this, how many stops you have to make to reach one person to the next. So again, where we have a very dense network, we have low levels of closeness, high levels of closeness. So in the middle of this network here, these guys are all very well connected to each other and are able to reach each other very easily. But if I'm this little person over here and I want to connect to this person over here, there's a lot of stops I have to go through on the way. And so this means that my level of closeness is very low because my ability to reach anyone else in the network, I've kind of got to go through a lot of stops to get to any of those people. Yep. And I've already talked about degree, so I won't worry about too much about that. And then betweenness is kind of similar to brokerage. We don't really see brokerage. Oh, we've got one here. So this person might be, we consider them a real interconnector because they're connecting these two teams here. So again, these are all, this is just basic terminology. Then what sits behind this terminology is analytical processes. And because of the way that social network analysis works, and because we're looking at the relationship as a unit of analysis, we can't use traditional statistical methods to do the calculations that we do when we're trying to take these images into kind of statistical numbers, etc. I'm not going to get into stats and stuff today because I knew we wouldn't get through it in time, and I just also didn't want to get bogged down, and also because there's so many that I just sort of thought it would just end up a bit of a laundry list. So I just wanted to kind of point out these key ideas that become important. Sorry, that's my dog at the door. That become important when we think about the structures of networks. And the other thing is that these have implications. And I think I'll talk about that when I get to these little examples.
So Rachel, how about you talk 10 more minutes and we have 5 minutes for question and answers.
Okay.
Cool.
All right. Is this
cool,
useful so far?
Yeah, awesome. Just keep going. I just wanted to remind the time.
Yeah, I'm not very good at time management, sorry.
No worries.
Maybe one day.
You're doing great.
All right. So I've plucked a few examples from the literature. The first two are from some of my colleagues at Swinburne Uni. So they're in the social network analysis space. And I've got two examples from some work that they've been doing on the communities that were affected by the Black Saturday bushfires a few years ago. And they've been tracking these communities since then and looking at people's recovery and using social network analysis to actually understand what might be going on. And for time, I probably won't dig in too deep to these, but you can have these slides, you can have a look at the papers, and then you can follow up with me. But what I wanted to kind of show was just some different ways that social network analysis has been used. And so this one is a longitudinal study, so it was done over a 2-year period. And so when we normally what we're used to in psychology and positive psychology is sort of looking at individual attributes and trying to understand what those relationships between the individual attributes might be. So we might, for example, look at, you know, whether people end up with PTSD as a consequence of going through a bushfire, and whether they also experience depression, and whether that's moderated by their financial stresses or something like that. And so what's being done here is that those things have been looked at, but also within the context of the number of organisations, so community-based groups, that each individual is involved in, and the number of people that they personally felt close to. And so what they were trying to analyse here was whether people who experience these different symptoms, whether their level of connectedness played a role in it. And so what they actually found was that there was a sort of curvilinear response that if you were involved in a few different community groups, then your level of PTSD was much lower. But if you were involved in no groups, or if you're involved in a lot of groups, then your incidence of PTSD went up. The other thing they found, and the other thing was also depression. So the more or fewer groups you're involved in, greater incidence of depression. And also if you had fewer close ties, you know, which we would kind of expect, but it was clearly demonstrated in this study. So for those people who felt kind of, let's call it lonely, because they had fewer people that they felt close to in the community, the higher the incidence of depression. And so their sort of finding was that being in a community where people have that connection to groups provides a benefit up to a point. And so what their kind of conclusion was that having that network is important, but if you kind of overextend yourself by being involved in lots of groups, it tended to exacerbate the levels of depression and PTSD, and their conclusion was people just like overstretching themselves. This one is with a similar sort of data set that they've been working on. And in this one, they were looking more at a kind of individual level. And so this wasn't longitudinal, this was a single time point. And so they were comparing people's levels of PTSD, also taking into account whether they relocated or had friends relocate after the bushfire, as the sort of individual attributes. And the disaster exposure was just that they went through the bushfire and the kind of level of loss that they experienced. So did they just live through the bushfire? Did they lose property? Did they lose life, etc., etc.? So that was a kind of level. And then they used what we call a network generator method. So when we collect data in social network analysis, there's a few different ways we can do it. In my study, because I've got a small, discrete community that I'm looking at, because it's an organisation, or two organisations, I've actually asked everybody to rate everybody else in the network. So I've got a full and complete network. What is more common, just because of the volume of data that you end up with and the onus that becomes on the individuals, is that you actually ask people to name or nominate specific individuals. So what I mean by that is, say if we're using this, everyone that's on this call today, and I wanted to find out who who likes each other in this group. So if I was going to try and collect the whole data set, I would send you a survey that asks you to rate everyone else on this call, whether you like them or not. The alternative way, and the way that they did it in this study, is that I could just email you the survey and say, who are the people you like the most in this group? And then you would write their names. And it's purely just a function of what's easiest and what's more possible with your data set. So in this case, they asked them to, everyone to name who are the people that you feel particularly close to in the community, and to write down their name, age, gender, and their contact information. And then they went and contacted all those people and did the same thing. Who do you feel particularly close to? What are their names, gender, age, blah, 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 blah. And so as you can imagine, collecting this data becomes very complex. And in this case, they've got 558 individuals. So you wouldn't be able to get them to rate each other, because otherwise they'd have a survey where they'd have to rate 558 people, just to explain those different methodologies. And so what they found in this particular study was that the more connected people were, the less depressed they were. But also, if they were connected to people, so one of the things they actually captured was whether individuals had left the community or not. And they did this by just getting their addresses. And so what they found was that if I was really close to people that had moved as a consequence of the bushfire, my level of depression went up. As opposed to if I was close to people who had stayed within the community. So again, it seems pretty obvious, but it allows us to actually demonstrate and analyze this kind of data. The other thing was that if I asked us all here in this group, who do you feel particularly connected to? If fewer people nominated me, my PTSD risk went up in this context. And so we can see then, so this is what would be called my in degree. So it's the number of people are pointing at me saying, yeah, I feel close to Rachel. The fewer people who said that, the higher my PTSD risk. The other thing is that we can see these kind of flow-on effects in the network. So if someone felt close to me and I had lost my home and I'd had a lot of trauma in the bushfires, your risk of PTSD went up. Yeah. And the other thing was that the level of actually social connection and the degree to which, so we call a key metric also in social network analysis is reciprocity. So this is whether, if I say I feel close to you and you say you feel close to me, then we have that reciprocity. Whereas if I say I feel close to you, I nominate you, and then you don't say that you feel close to me, there's an asymmetry there. And so what they found was that people who were less reciprocally connected to each other, and also where there was more clustering, like we talked about before, where there's more fragmentation in the network, again, the PTSD risk went up, or incidence of PTSD went up. All right, I know I'm running out of time. I'm going to skip over this one. I'll let you have a look at it yourself. This one just looked at levels of hope and well-being in adolescent networks. And they found that there was a strong relationship between, first of all, coincidence of levels of hope and well-being within the social groups. And then they also found that the level of hope within the group itself had a role in the individual levels of social and psychological well-being. So skip over that. So this is my work that I'm doing, which I'll talk really quickly about it, and then I'll shut up and you guys can talk. So what I'm looking at is 2 organisations that are both social enterprises. And I've looked at a whole range of relationships within the organisations. Talk to that in a sec. And so I just wanted to quickly show you, just to help illustrate some of these concepts. What I did in the energising network questions was I asked everyone in the organisation to rate each other on a level from 1, which was that they're very de-energizing, so there's someone that just sucks the life out of me when I interact with them, to very energizing. So when I interact with that person, I feel more alive and energized. And so you can see here, so we've got our nodes, our little dots, and then the lines connecting them. And as you can see quite obviously here, that people who rate each other as energizing, you can see that this network is much more dense than the people who say that the other person drains them. And so what we can determine sort of immediately just from looking at these 2 different sociograms is that the levels of energizing in this group of people is much, much higher than the levels of de-energizing. Yeah. So just to kind of show you a working example of how we can do this visually at the first level. And then what I start to do is look at, so the lines that are blue are where it's reciprocated. So where, for example, this person here has said this person is energizing and this person has said that the other person is energizing. The lines that are grey are where it's not reciprocated. So this person here I didn't actually have any data from, so that's why they're not there. But in this example here, this person has said that this person is energizing, but this person hasn't said it in response. So just so that that becomes clear for you. And so we can see in this draining map that there's one person here that a lot of people have said is draining. And because it's blue, you can determine that they've said in return that that person is draining to them. And so this is where I'm kind of at the moment. So I've got some preliminary findings. As was evident, we've got this very highly positive, very dense networks in these organisations. I've also measured, so when we get to these individual attributes, I've measured people's level of flourishing and PSYCAP and a bunch of demographic factors. And the key thing that's kind of come out that's interesting is that there's a relationship between people's levels of well-being and the number of people that they say energize them. So that's kind of an interesting finding I'm playing with at the moment, and sort of speaks to what we call these kind of outgoing effects. And so it's about how you perceive your network. And so if you're within a group of people that you find energizing, the indication is that your well-being is going to be higher, as opposed to if you feel like you're in a group of people that you find really draining, presumption is that your well-being will go down. And because this is a mixed method study, what I've been particularly interested in is what is going on in these organisations that might be giving rise to these highly positive networks of energising, trust, support, and a whole bunch of stuff that I've looked at. So I've been digging into that as well in a qualitative fashion. I know we're at time, so this was my last little slide, which I will now just flip over to you guys for any questions.
Thank you, Rachel. Very nice presentation. Any questions for Rachel?
Thanks, Rowan.
Can I ask a question myself?
As long as it's not hard.
No, it's easy. So which software do you use?
So I was trained using software that's called UCINet. It comes out of the group in Kentucky. So there's a school of social network analysis in Kentucky that is kind of one of the really leading groups in the world. And they've developed this software called UCINet. And it's kind of, I think it's kind of the most accessible, easy software to use. It took me a while to get my head around it. I've played around.
You need to write codes, or it's interactive?
No, you just upload data sets in Excel. And then it's got this integrated thing called NetDraw. So you basically click a button and then it converts your data set into those drawings. So I created these in NetDraw, and then UCI does the calculations for you. So
is it freeware, or you need to pay for it?
It's pretty cheap. I think it's like $50 or something. Yeah. I know as well that I've messed around a little bit in Gephi. I had a go in R, but I just found R was too hard for me because it involved a lot of coding, and I'm not that way inclined. I also know people that have used Atlas, but I would say UCINet's a good starting point.
Daniela asks, can you use NVivo for this?
You can. So NVivo has now got some built-in SNA functionality. I've had a bit of a play with it, but I've been limited because I work on a Mac and it's only in the PC version of NVivo. But the play that I've had with it, it has pretty limited functionality. It can create a few basic sociograms, but I found it couldn't do a lot of very good mathematical processing, but it's okay if you want to just do visualizations. Any other questions?
Rachel, Edwina here. I was just, obviously my interest is in schools, but community more broadly too. But just the simplification of this, the possibilities of perhaps teachers being given some tools to map classrooms, but also thinking around, well, what would an optimal network for a flourishing classroom look like? I was really fascinated by the diagrams and just how, I guess, using this as a way in for teaching teachers around perhaps doing some evaluations of their classrooms. So I just wondered, and then looking at that more broadly in schools, and then I guess particularly at this time when there's a lot of communities and certainly where we are in Maroondah, looking at recovery, how, and the work that you did around the bushfires, how we can use this information going forward, but equally, how do we, how we can get this measurement?
Yeah, so there's kind of a few answers to this, because in many ways, social network analysis is a bit like saying, how could we use statistics? So it's so flexible that it really comes down to what is it that you're trying to understand, and so then what would be the research design that would go along with it. And you can start with really simple, basic, tools. So you can actually just start, like, let me see if I can quickly find an example. You can actually just get people to draw their own. And often it's very simple to just get people to use like a little circle map where they put themselves at the center, and then they actually just write the names of the people that they feel closest to, and then the people they don't. But in a classroom setting, you could either have the teacher, depending on how well the teacher, and it'd probably be easier in a primary school setting where the teacher's with the kids all day, as a very rough, easy starting point. You could actually get the teacher to kind of say, who are the kids that are connected to each other? Or you could ask the kids. So one of my colleagues at Swinburne, she did her PhD looking at, she did a longitudinal study looking at the development of social relationships in the classroom based on the attributes of the teacher. So the kids' relationships with the teacher and how that then impacted and affected the way that the kids' relationships formed over time. So yeah, it kind of just comes down to what do you kind of want to know, and so then how would we go about designing something that would help us find that out?
I think the finding around the energising, the more energising people we feel we have, the greater the well-being, is evidence that it obviously is going to be useful. But yeah, happy to chat with you further, because really keen to look at how we can apply this fairly simply, just to be able to provide some, I guess, some more evaluation and measurement, and then mapping that and looking at that over time and seeing if we can shift that, if there are perhaps isolated groups or isolated individuals.
Yeah. Well, there's one project you might be interested in. So another group at Swinburne, so not the social network analysis guys, but the community connections team have got a collaboration going with the Red Cross at the moment, which is about loneliness. And they've created a digital tool that enables people to go in and actually start to conceptualize their social network. So similar to that little picture that I showed. And the purpose of people doing that is actually to help people identify. And so to me, it's a bit of a wellbeing literacy intervention, because it's about helping people to connect to, oh yeah, I do have connections in this community. I just thought I didn't. And so it's actually about shifting people's thinking and their mindset around what loneliness means and who might be actually resources and connections that they do have that they've kind of been blind to in some way, shape or form. Yeah, and I'm in conversation with a group at the moment, and we're thinking about using that kind of basic visualization tool in a program that's built around social connection, and getting people to kind of, sketch out who they're connected to at the beginning of the program, and then sketch it out again at the end of the program and see what changes, because what we're anticipating is, because the social connectedness is built through the program, that their social maps will look quite different at the end. And they'll essentially move people more closer to them because they've improved those relationships. And then, if we were to sort of apply research to it, we could then analyse their two maps from the beginning to the end and see how those relationships have shifted. So we can do stuff like that as well.
Sounds great. And see lots of applications, like year 7s coming in at, on their first day, and mapping who knows who, and then doing that at the end of the year, or even after a particular, 2 weeks of transition and so on. So yeah.
And so the key thing is that it helps us give visibility to relationships, which are kind of invisible things, and are often emotive things, but also exist as cognitive relationships, interaction-based relationships. So there's more than just those emotional connections that we have to people. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions from Rachel?
Or if there's any ideas that you're thinking, could I use SNA for this?
Gavin has a question, actually.
Awesome. Hey, Gavin.
I'm just wondering what a typical data set looks like.
It looks like a spreadsheet. So, so often it's a binary spreadsheet. So you would have, can pull one up if you're interested in hanging around. So normally what you have is a matrix. So you have all the names down the column. So in my data set, for example, because mine isn't too big, I can do it this way. I've got all the names down the side on the first column, sorry. And then the heading across the top is all the names again. And then if it's a binary thing, so, whether they know each other or not, it's literally a 1 or a 0. So, you know, if it's got Rachel, Gavin, Mosen, and then Rachel, Gavin, Mosen, Rachel to Rachel would be a 0 or 1, because I know myself, obviously. And then if I know Gavin, I would put a 1 next to it. But if I don't know Mosen, I would put a 0. And then it just ends up being this matrix. And then I just suck that matrix into UCINet, press the magic buttons, and then try and interpret the data.
Great. Great job on the presentation as well. So do you build the spreadsheet like that by putting in those numbers, or does that happen automatically when you put out the sort of survey, or how does that work?
I have to manipulate it a little bit. Where it gets complicated, so I've had it pretty easy because my data set is quite small. So one of my organizations is 18 people. So I've got an 18 by 18 matrix. But then I have separate matrices for each relationship. Yeah. So I've got my energizer matrix, my trust matrix, my interaction frequency matrix, etc., etc. Where it gets a little bit more complicated, so say in the example, the bushfire one, where they're using the name generator method, the data gets very unwieldy very fast, because you are literally capturing, so if I get data from you, Gavin, where I say, okay, Gavin, who are your closest friends at Melbourne Uni? And you say, Di, Peggy, and Jackie. And then I ask Jackie, and she says, Becky, Peggy, and Lee. And then I've sort of got to manually collate all that data and match it. And as you can imagine, in something like the bushfire thing, they actually did all this data collection by phone. So it was a massive task, because they were literally ringing people up and then saying, okay, tell me who are the people that you feel closest to. And they'd say Mary Smith. So they'd type Mary Smith, you know, Bill Bloggs and bloody blah. And then they'd have to go and ring up those people. And then they might say 3 completely different people. And so they're going to get this snowball effect over time. And as they're collecting the data, they don't actually know if there's going to be any overlaps. Yeah. So if I ring Mary and she says, I'm closest to Phil, Joe, and Harry, and then I ring Phil, Joe, and Harry, and none of them mention Mary, then I've got this whole other set of names. And so it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I've got to match those names. And then sometimes people spell names incorrectly, or they have typos. So you've got to go and, so I've been fortunate in that I haven't had to go through that. But it can get very complicated very fast. Yeah.
Rachel, you mentioned Energizer Network and Trust. Do you find that those two are similar, or are they different?
Well, mostly as a function of, in my data, so these are the network measures that I've got, how energizing or de-energizing someone is, the level of trust. So they've actually rated everybody from I don't trust them at all to I highly trust them. How much they get support from them, how much they get advice, which I've misspelled. And so just as a nature of the density of this network, what I'm finding is that most of the relationships are very highly correlated, because they just really like each other. Like because of the nature of the organization, which is now what I'm trying to unpack, is why are these relationships so positively valenced? And so, yeah, the trust and who people go to, you know, when I ask them, you know, do you get advice from this person? They're fairly highly rated as well, because it's just the nature of this organization. So I wouldn't necessarily assume that energizing and trust is necessarily 100% related. It might be. It just so happens in my data set, everything's kind of strong. Yeah.
And do you think with this social enterprise, just by its very nature, that it has a unique feature in its relatedness in this network diagram than other, like, are you comparing to other types of organisations?
No, only in the sense that most other work on energizers has been done in non-social enterprises. And my data is showing that it's a much more dense network. So there's a lot more energizing going on. And so part of what is my contribution from this study is trying to demonstrate that this may be a feature of social enterprise, because there's, within the ones that I'm looking at, they're very highly relationally oriented. And so part of my findings is that typically social enterprises are kind of positioned as organizations that are about kind of giving people a leg up. And normally their metric is that whether they're giving people paid employment. And so what I'm going to be arguing is that they give people a lot more than that. And in particular, what seems to be going on when I analyse the qual data is that they're organisations that have a very highly authenticity reinforcing culture within them. And so people feel free to be who they are. And they're people that, because they're working in social enterprise, they've experienced some kind of marginalisation or stigmatisation out in the real world, because they've been, you know, the reason they're in the social enterprise is because they've experienced some form of disadvantage. And so what's going on for them, was what they're telling me, is that here, I'm celebrated for who I am. I'm encouraged to be who I am. And so they have this very strong identity reinforcement. Everything is strengths reinforcing as well. And so the actual environment becomes a place where their well-being is just fostered. So it's a very generative environment. And so what they're telling me is that when I look at when they start telling me about the characteristics of the people that energize them, it's all this stuff around that they let me be who I am. And trust comes into it, a whole bunch of stuff. But yeah, it tends to be part of the feature of the organisation, that they're very human-centred. And so it becomes about the people.
And what are you hoping to do with this information? Is it to show other businesses about, you know, like the comparison of the networks, to say perhaps there's some features of social enterprise that need to go elsewhere, or what's, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a few different things. So first of all, just like theoretically, what I'm demonstrating is that there's very high levels of social capital in these organisations. And because we know a lot about social capital now, it kind of makes sense that because of the social capital that's being built within the organisations, that it's having these well-being flow-on effects. That, so from a policy level, we need to stop thinking about social enterprise as just organisations that give people jobs that then give them stable employment, but they're actually kind of vectors of social capital contribution in the community, and that they're building people's social capital as well as their kind of economic and financial capital. And then in terms of other organisations, I think one of the key messages I want to sort of get out there is this idea of that authenticity supportive cultures give you a much, they're an enabler of social capital within the organisations. And it kind of, I think part of that message is around diversity as well, because the less marginalisation people experience, the more they're energised, the more they trust each other, the more they feel that sense of belonging and social cohesion within the organisation. And we can kind of actively demonstrate that.
Wonderful. It's great,
I'm still
Rachel.
muddling
Thank
through
you
all
so
that
much.
stuff.
No, it's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm way over time. Is that okay?
So we can have one more question if someone has a question.
Jess, have you been here the whole time? Unmute yourself, love. She must have gone to sleep. I've bored her to tears.
All right. All right, so it sounds like people have asked all of the questions for today. Thank you so much, Rachel. It was great. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I start recording now.